Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 24th of July. Today we're going to be talking about the situation around Zvatove axis because I was not able to talk about it over the past 2 days. So now we're going to be covering everything that I missed from this specific direction because this sector really has been abundant with news and we're seeing some pretty significant Russian attacks and they have been able to gain some land that we have not seen them be able to gain in really months, honestly. Last time they captured this much land was in the Bakhmut battle in late May. And since then, they haven't really been on the offensive mode on any of these sectors. And so now we've seen the Russians begin to activate their attacks generally across the entire Kremina-Zvatove line, Kremina-Zvatove, and then Kupiansk further to the north. And I would say this started about a month ago. We had videos from about a month ago talking about the Russians beginning offensive activities to the north of Kupiansk. And that was all true. They were beginning to engage the Ukrainians and launch their own attacks to gauge the Ukrainian defenses. But they were not that successful. And the Russians were not really looking to secure major breakthroughs. They weren't pouring in as many resources. But over the past weeks, we've seen a shift with Russians beginning to send more reinforcements into this area. And really, the numbers are debated. But regardless, the amount of Russian forces in here has expanded and they are beginning to attack on different axes. And it started, as I said before, about 2 weeks ago, generally with attacks towards Torske, Zarichny, all these different towns that are adjacent to the Zherebets River. Because in essence, the Russian goal with these attacks is to push the Ukrainians out of their bridgehead, which is across the Zherebets River, which is an important river that the Ukrainians crossed, which gives them a bridgehead into Crimea. So that's where most of Russia's attacks have been focused. But something happened on July 16th, which was very interesting, and at the time we talked about it in our video. The Ukrainians, they launched an attack onto the town of Karmazhinivka. And this is a town that is a bit to the north of where most of the fighting was going on. And it seems like the Ukrainians were launching a rather small operation, but nonetheless, they were trying to cross the Zherebets River. So the Ukrainians actually initiated a lot of the confrontations on the sector initially on the 16th. They were repulsed by the Russian defenses in this area, mainly by the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, this unit over here. And then the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, they counterattacked. And then the following day, on the 17th, they actually crossed the river and established the bridgehead across the Zherebets River. Because this town, Karmazhinivka, is just to the east of the Zherebets River. Zherebets River, it runs around here, you can see. And the initial crossing of the river by the Russians really occurred around this area. And I'm being very rough with my sketches, but this is generally the square where the Russians initially established their bridgehead. Just to the southwest of Karmazhinivka, in some of the forested areas over here where the infantry had concealment. So that's how this all started out. And then the Russians, they continued expanding their bridgehead over the following days. On the 19th, they also continued to expand their bridgehead, and the Ukrainians, they noticed that the Russians were beginning to press in a certain area, that perhaps the Russians had discovered a weak point in the Ukrainian lines, and they did move in some reinforcements. We talked about it at the time. They moved a battery, an artillery battery, to the town of Makivka, which is a significant Ukrainian node of defense at the moment in the Zherebets River Valley. So they moved in M777s that were probably aimed at the advancing Russian forces to the north. And they also moved reinforcements from several different units around the entire Zvatove axis, including the 25th Airborne Brigade. So they were sent to hold the line. And for about maybe 5-6 days, they were able to keep the Russians at bay, you could say. But when we really saw the major breakthrough that I'm talking about today in this video, and when I say major, I want to just clarify that this is not existential. When I say major, obviously, I'm talking about within the context of this front, that this is a major development because we have not seen really any changes from either side on this level for months, ever since the initial Ukrainian counteroffensive in this area nearly a year ago. And that's why I'm calling it major, because this is the largest extent. And I'm going to talk about the amount of territory that has been retaken in a second. But we really saw the breakthrough begin on the 22nd of July, 2 days ago, when the Russians expanded their bridgehead to this entire area over here that I'm going to mark with this red line. So this is all the area that the Russians were able to take over. What's important is that the Russians, they secured many different forested areas that will give them concealment. Here are just some of them. And they secured hills that overlook an important valley where Ukrainians are stationed. So the Ukrainians, they're stationed on this valley within this town called Novogorivka. This is Novogorivka, and it's ensuing valley. And so the Russians have positions within that valley. They have positions in all the hedgerows throughout that valley, on the eastern side at least. And then they have control of forested areas, plains, farmland to the south of it. And those are all hills overlooking the valley, where you have these Ukrainian reinforcements that were moved in. And the thing is, these gains, they may not seem like a lot, but just in terms of specific numbers, the initial bridgehead that the Russians established, which is the one that's to the southwest of the town of Kamazhinivka over here, which was generally around that square. When Russia crossed over on July 17th and took that over, they secured 1.96 square miles, or the equivalent of 5 square kilometers. And then all of the gains that Russia made since the 22nd of July, which is, just past 2 days, mainly happened on the 22nd, not as much on the 23rd. But the amount of land that Russia retook on the 22nd amounts to 8.34 square miles, which is also the same thing as 21.6 square kilometers. So in total, the Russians, they were able to retake 10.3 square miles, aka 26.6 square kilometers. Now, if you don't really understand the perspective of that, just to give you an idea, that is 0.1% of the entirety of Luhansk Oblast. This is Luhansk Oblast. Now, this is just for reference. I'm not trying to minimize it because undoubtedly on this front, this is a major activation. And the reason why it's so important is because the Ukrainians, they're in control of several heights that are to the west of the area where the Russians are now attacking towards. And this is generally where it's located. I'm going to open the elevation map later, but this is generally these heights. The Russians, they need to approach these heights and take them over in order to establish total domination over all of the lands in Kharkiv and Luhansk that are to the east of the Oskil River. Because what's the overarching goal for the Russians? It would be to expel the Ukrainians across the Oskil River. Now, that's an extremely difficult task because the Ukrainians have many different brigades that are stationed over here. You could see them on my map, and the Russians would have to advance 15 miles at certain areas, sometimes 12 miles in the narrower areas. But you can see that's a significant amount of land that they need to take over. And we haven't really seen any sort of Russian success in terms of major offensives since the beginning of the war at such a pace. Just for perspective, they advanced in one direction 3 miles since they established that bridgehead. So now we're going to have to see if they keep up that momentum. But the goal would be to establish control over the heights that allow the Ukrainians to fire artillery towards the Russian positions on the front line, first of all, because these Russian positions on the front line are mainly on valleys, and then also around towns like Svatove and across the entire Svatove River Valley and all of the Russian fortifications that they built after the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year to the east of the Svatove River Valley. So that's just some of the significance, but I'll open up the elevation map later. Talk more about Russian gains. If we go to the south, the Ukrainians, they had been attacking Dibrova really nonstop, even after the Russians began launching their offensive activities around Svatove even 2 weeks ago. The Ukrainians continued attacking Dibrova from the south. But now we have confirmation that the Russians have conducted an attack of their own, and they've established a bit of a buffer to the south of Dibrova. Not much land was taken. They really stopped at this road, which runs through the Zherebets forest, which is a road that presumably the Ukrainians used to supply their forward positions throughout the entire forest. And then this road, it also connects to a local electric substation. So that may be a Ukrainian forward position in this entire sector. But again, this is a relatively minor change. Another change that occurred, and this happened today on the 23rd, actually yesterday. Now it's 24th. But the Ukrainians, they were pushed back across another part of the Zherebets River. So we already established how the Russians crossed over the Zherebets River around Karmazhinivka and around Kovalivka. But on the 23rd, the Russians also crossed over on the northern part of Raihorodka. And there's actually a local crossing over here. I don't know if it's destroyed, so it may be the Russians just crossed using a pontoon or by foot, because it is very narrow over here. But they did cross over the river across Raihorodka and established a little bridgehead. Now, this will give the Russians the opportunity to attack Nadia and Serhivka, and they can also begin to try to encircle Serhivka because there's a Russian bridgehead just to the south of Serhivka, so you could see how a two-pronged attack would be formed. So this may force the Ukrainians, whatever force there is, which would be very small because of how small this town is in general and how lightly defended the entire Zherebets River was in this specific area, really for months up until Russia established the bridgehead. So the Ukrainians may be forced to withdraw, and that would give Russian control of even more towns that are across the Zherebets River. And once they establish a permanent foothold in these areas, it becomes much easier to launch further attacks deeper in. And so that's just a quick rundown of the territorial gains. But now let's get a look at the actual elevation for all of this, because that is extremely important. So I quickly sketched over here the Zherebets River in blue and the current front line in red. What you can see is that the Russians have control of some of the hills, not all of them admittedly, but some of the hills, and I'll use a different color than red, some of the hills over here that are overlooking the Novogehorivka Valley. And the Ukrainians, a lot of their main defensive nodes in this area, where they moved all of their reinforcements from the 25th Brigade, for instance, they were on this valley in Novogehorivka. And now the Russians have positions within that town itself, and within the hedgerows to the east of it, and in the hills to the south that are overlooking it. So the Russians will be firing towards it, and they will attempt to flank it, admittedly. And now because the Russians have positions on a ridge, they are on equal footing with the main ridge that I was talking about, that the Ukrainians control a bit to the west over here. So this ridge is extremely important because it is pretty far away from the front line, so it's a good position to put artillery, but it will still hit the front line, and it could go even deeper depending on what sort of howitzer you're using. Medium range howitzers, for instance, could be used in this area to attack towns like Svatove and attack all of the river valley around there. And that's all on low elevation. I'll move to it in a second. But you could see how it's on extremely high elevation, the Ukrainian positions, about 200 meters above sea level, versus, for instance, the Russian front line, which is adjacent to the Zherebets River, which is drawn in blue over there. So you could see how this mismatch made it hard for Russia to advance. But now that they have control of these heights to the south, they may be able to push through this ridge over here and reach the Ukrainian high ground over here and really nullify that Ukrainian advantage. And then, if you zoom out a little, let's assume that the Russians are able to do that. If the Russians were able to control all these ridges over here, then they would have amazing positions to store their artillery and fire their artillery, which in this area, by the way, I want to mention this because it's extremely important, but in some areas on the front line, the difference in artillery in terms of quantity is a bit closer, but on this specific sector, Svatove, this is one of the areas where Russia has one of the largest artillery overmatches on the entire front line. So it's very good in terms of Russian artillery. It's very advantageous for them to set up all of their howitzers over here across the entire ridge, and then they could fire upon the Ukrainian positions that are adjacent to the Oskil River over here. And because the Russians would be firing onto the river, it will make it very hard for the Ukrainians to move reinforcements, resupply, and cross over the river, especially because this river is so wide in comparison to the Zherebets River. Zherebets River is pretty narrow and it's not that deep. Oskil is a totally different story. That's a massive river, so it's way harder to cross over it. And they're going to be constantly bombarded by the Russian forces, and even if they cross over, when they reach the defensive nodes like Borova over here, they will still be pounded, and they will still be on lower elevation compared to the Russian forces. So the Russians will have a pretty clear view of the entire Oskil River Valley, and that's why Russians are trying to push in this area. That's why they're trying to establish control over all of these ridges over here that we were marking in blue. Just to show you Svatove, because I said I would. Svatove is over here. That's probably the largest Russian city in this entire region. And that's where they have a lot of their forward command stations and equipment and everything. And that's in a valley. And then all of the towns that are adjacent to the river on the same line, they're also in a valley. And then some of the fortifications that Russia built to the west, or to the east, sorry, those are on a bit of a ridge, some of them, but some of them are also in a valley. And so the entire idea is that the Ukrainians do have an advantage at the moment in terms of their local geography, but that could be avoided if the Russians are able to quickly advance in this region. And it does seem like the Ukrainians were caught off guard because nobody was really expecting this Russian attack from this sector. We've been talking about Russian attacks towards, you know, Torsk, Zherebets, Kupiansk. Sure, that was already established, and the Ukrainians moved a lot of their defenses in that direction. Same thing with Novoselivsk. The Russians attacked in that area for a couple of weeks, and there was some very heavy fighting. Now it's sort of died down, and they haven't established full control of the town yet. It's a bit of a gray zone, but still, that diverted away Ukrainian attention from other parts of the front line, and so there was really no Ukrainian strong defense around this part of the Zherebets River, around Karmizhinivka, when Russia initially launched that attack on the 17th, following the Ukrainian attack, which was very small in scope. So now the Ukrainians, how many units do they have around here to defend against the Russian breakthrough? Well, they have the 66th Separate Mechanized Brigade, so that's one brigade. They have this National Guard unit. I don't know its size in terms of personnel, because the Ukrainian brigade ideally would have upwards of 4,000 men, but it's probably closer to 2,000 men, or maybe even less, depending on the unit. And then 40th Artillery Brigade, and you also have different drone groups and the 22nd Motorized Infantry Battalion, generally in this area. And then, of course, there are different units that could be moved in from the Svatove sector, because there are a lot there. 25th, for instance, some of its battalions have been moved to defend against the Bridgehead. And there's a bunch of other assault brigades. These are battle-hardened units that have experience in defending against Russian assaults and counterattacking in their own right, so they could play a big role in defending from the Russian assaults in this area. So we're going to have to see if Russia's serious about this, because if they are, then it could lead to more wide-scale changes. I'm not going to say that the entire Oskil River is going to be taken over by the Russians. That's still unrealistic, and it's going to require much more than what the Russians have put in at the moment. If we look at the Russian composition in this area, the main fighting has only been done by one motor rifle brigade. And again, their size is like ranges from 2,000 to 8,000, but they're probably on way lower on the lower end, around maybe 2,000, 3,000 as well. I can't say that for sure, but the number 8,000 does seem pretty unrealistic when you consider the amount of brigades that Russia really has on the entire Svatove sector, and then you compare it to the numbers that are published for how many Russians are manning the entire sector. Like the math wouldn't add up if you assumed that all of the Russian forces in each brigade were at full capacity, at full power, at full strength. If they were, then Russia would have upwards of 115,000 men across the entire front, and it seems like the numbers are closer to 70,000. But anyway, you have the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade here, you have the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, and the 423rd Motor Rifle Regiment. So that's just generally the units that Russia has in this area that are involved in the attack. Not all of the men, obviously, but that's the pool of men that Russia could utilize if they want to tap further into the assaults in this direction. So that's it for the Svatove sector. Let's go to Bakhmut quickly and talk about the situation there, because there are some changes that must be discussed. So the Russians, they actually tried counterattacking to the southwest of the Vasilivka. And if you recall, the Ukrainians, they launched some of their own attacks a few days ago from Orakovo Vasilivka through this valley, pushing towards Dubovo Vasilivka. They also pushed through the E40 highway and towards the Liznyansk. And so Ukrainians generally are attacking this northern flank of Bakhmut, but it seems like the Russians launched their own attack towards Frihorivka. There wasn't any major gain confirmed. It seems like it was repulsed, but it does show that the Russians are trying to conduct an active defense to prevent a Ukrainian breakthrough of their own towards the northern supply lines into Bakhmut. And then a bit to the south, the Ukrainians did advance perhaps less than a mile, half a mile, you could say, towards Yahidne and the northern part of Bakhmut itself. And this comes after the Ukrainians failed to enter Berkivka. They initially occupied part of it, but were pushed out. And since then, the front has really stabilized. So Ukraine has shifted focus a bit to the south, trying to advance towards Yahidne. And so far, they have been able to make minor gains, but they are still about half a mile away from the outskirts of Yahidne, and then about 1.5 miles away from the main roads that are supplying Bakhmut. Then a bit to the south, around Klishivka, the situation has now changed around the western side of the town, around the forests. It's just more of Ukraine inching towards the forested areas and then subsequently into the town itself and the houses there. Really, the main thing that occurred is that the Ukrainians have now pushed very, very close to Andriivka. And we talked about that ad nauseum in the previous video, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. But again, Andriivka is a town on the southern flank of Klishivka, and there's a road that supplies the Russian forces in Klishivka that goes through Andriivka. So it's important that the Russians hold the town, but now the Ukrainians are within about 1.5, 1.6 miles of the town itself, and a lot of the area in between the Ukrainian line and the Russian line is just a gray zone. So you could see the blue lines, the Russian Ukraine lines, specifically shifting to the right and entering the town very soon, because the Ukrainians certainly have made progress in this area. Just a few days ago, before I made this last update to the map, the Ukrainians were about 0.7, 0.8 miles away from Andriivka. So now they are advancing, and it's at a rate which does show that Ukraine could actually enter the town very soon, unless Russia is able to send in reinforcements. So a big issue which I've seen Russian sources complain about. So this is not Ukrainian. This is Russian sources saying that there's a lack of troop rotation for the Russian forces over here, and this is something we heard in Zaporozhye. But it seems like that issue is even more pervasive here. So the same units like the 106 Guards Airborne Division, like the 68th Tank Regiment, like the Spetsnaz Brigade, they've probably been over here, and the same men from each company that is defending on the front line has probably been fighting for an extended period of time, and they do need now recuperation, and they do need to refill their ranks. And it seems like perhaps it's due to the fact that Russia is sending a lot of resources to other fronts, or maybe it's because of issues with supply due to Ukrainian artillery control, due to their control of the heights at the moment. I don't know the reason. But either way, there is a complaint from the Russian side that they're not rotating their men enough. And when you're not doing that, they're getting tired, they're getting fatigued. And the Ukrainians are actually rotating their men over here. They are sending in reinforcements from multiple different units that we've talked about extensively. And they are moving in new equipment into this area every day. And so it's not a good situation. But what I will say as a silver lining for Russia is that since my last video, the Ukrainians have not been able to infiltrate into the town of Klishivka itself. So we're going to have to see if Ukrainian movements on the southern flank have any sway on that. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.